Good day, everyone. There is an experience in life that we all encounter at different stages, a season of isolation, a time when we feel cut off, separated, and perhaps even abandoned. It's that moment in life when the noise quiets, the hustle fades, and we find ourselves alone with our thoughts. For many, this is a terrifying place. We often run from it. But today I want to talk about a powerful truth. God always has a purpose in your isolation. Isolation is often misunderstood. Many associate it with punishment, failure, or rejection. They see it as a curse rather than a potential blessing. But what if I told you that isolation is not a curse, but an essential tool in God's divine plan for your life? What if I told you that some of the greatest transformations in history happen in the quiet places of isolation? I am here to remind you today that when you are isolated, God is preparing you. He is shaping you. He is equipping you for something far greater than you can imagine. The Bible is filled with stories of men and women who went through seasons of isolation before stepping into their destiny. These are not stories of random coincidence. They are deliberate patterns established by God to reveal His process of preparation. Isolation is not just an interruption in life. It is a place of divine intervention. Let us begin with a man named Moses. Moses was raised in the palace of Egypt, enjoying the luxuries and privileges of royalty. But after an impulsive action led to the death of an Egyptian, Moses fled to the wilderness. There, in the desert, isolated from the people he was destined to lead, Moses spent 40 years. To the untrained eye, it would seem as though Moses was forgotten, abandoned, and useless. But during that season of isolation, God was working on Moses' character. He was teaching him patience, humility, and leadership. It was in the quiet, remote place of isolation that Moses was prepared to lead the Israelites out of slavery. Isolation is the birthplace of preparation. Another powerful example is David, the shepherd boy who would become king. Before David sat on the throne of Israel, he was anointed by the prophet Samuel in front of his brothers. But instead of stepping into the palace immediately, David was sent back to the fields to tend sheep. For years, David experienced isolation, watching over his flock in the wilderness. But it was in those lonely fields where David learned to trust God completely. It was in isolation that David learned to fight lions and bears, preparing him for his battle with Goliath. It was in isolation that David learned to worship, to write the Psalms, and to develop a heart after God's own heart. Isolation was not a punishment. It was a season of preparation. And then there's Joseph, a man who had a dream of greatness. But before Joseph could step into his destiny, he went through years of isolation. His brothers betrayed him, sold him into slavery, and he ended up in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But even in that prison cell, God was working on Joseph. He was refining him, teaching him how to lead with integrity, how to forgive, and how to trust in God's timing. When the time was right, Joseph was elevated from the prison to the palace, from isolation to influence. Isolation was the crucible that shaped his character. Time and time again, we see the same pattern. Before greatness, there is isolation. Before promotion, there is preparation. God uses isolation as a tool to shape and refine those whom He calls. Isolation can feel uncomfortable because it strips away distractions. It separates you from what is familiar, from the comforts of life, and from the opinions of others. But let me remind you that isolation is God's incubator. It is in isolation that God does some of His most profound work in us. An incubator is a controlled environment designed to protect and nourish something until it is ready to emerge. In much the same way, God uses seasons of isolation to protect and nourish the dreams, visions, and purposes He has placed within you. Isolation is where God shelters you from premature exposure, where He develops the character, the endurance, and the strength that you will need for the journey ahead. Consider the story of the Apostle Paul. After his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, Paul did not immediately step into his ministry. Instead, Paul spent 3 years in the Arabian desert in isolation. It was during this time that God revealed deep truths to Paul, preparing him for his mission to spread the gospel to the Gentiles. In isolation, Paul learned the depth of God's grace, mercy, and power. His letters, which we now read as part of the New Testament, were shaped by those moments of solitude where God imparted wisdom to him. Paul's isolation was not wasted time, it was sacred time, time where God was incubating His purpose. Many of us are so focused on activity, on movement, on doing, that we miss the value of stillness. But God is not in a rush. He is more concerned with the process than the outcome. He is more concerned with who you are becoming than with what you are accomplishing. In the place of isolation, God can remove distractions and bring you to a place where you can hear His voice clearly. It is a place where you can stop striving and start listening. One of the most powerful purposes of isolation is that it brings revelation. In the noise of life, it is easy to miss the voice of God. But in the quiet place, when you are stripped of all distractions, you can hear Him more clearly. Let me remind you of the story of Elijah. After a great victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah found himself running for his life, afraid and alone. He fled to the wilderness, feeling defeated, isolated, and ready to give up. But it was in that place of isolation that Elijah encountered God in a profound way. As Elijah stood in a cave on Mount Horeb, a mighty wind tore through the mountains, an earthquake shook the ground, and a fire blazed before him. But God was not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, God spoke to Elijah in a still, small voice. It was in the quiet, in the stillness, in the isolation, that God revealed Himself to Elijah in a new way. Isolation brings clarity. It removes the distractions of the world so that you can see and hear God more clearly. It is in isolation that God can reveal His plans and purposes for your life. He may not speak in the way you expect, but if you listen closely, you will hear His still, small voice. Jacob also experienced profound revelation in isolation. In Genesis 32, we read about how Jacob wrestled with God all night long. This encounter did not happen in the midst of a crowd or a busy city. It happened in the stillness of the night when Jacob was alone, isolated. It was in that place of solitude that Jacob's identity was changed forever. He went from being Jacob, the deceiver, to Israel, the father of a nation. The revelation of who God was and who Jacob was meant to be came in a moment of isolation. Sometimes God allows us to go through seasons of isolation so that He can reveal things to us that we would not otherwise see. He wants to show you who He is, who you are, and what He has called you to do. But to receive that revelation, you must be willing to embrace the stillness and trust the process. Another purpose of isolation is that it develops strength and endurance. Just as a seed must go through a period of darkness in the soil before it can break through the ground and grow, so must we go through seasons of isolation to develop the strength we need for the future. In isolation, God often allows us to face challenges that test our faith, patience, and perseverance. It is in these moments that we learn to trust Him more deeply and rely on His strength rather than our own. God is more concerned with developing your character than your comfort. And he uses isolation to strip away the things that are holding you back. Consider the life of Jesus. After his baptism, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasted for 40 days and was tempted by the devil. Jesus, the Son of God, went through a season of isolation before beginning his public ministry. It was in the wilderness that Jesus faced temptation, not surrounded by people, but alone. And it was in that place of isolation that Jesus' strength, faith, and reliance on the Father were tested and strengthened. If Jesus, who was without sin, needed to go through a season of isolation to prepare for his mission, how much more do we need that time to be strengthened for the journey ahead? Isolation is where God refines us, is where he strips away the things that are not of him, the things that will hinder us in our calling. In isolation, God teaches us to endure, to persevere, and to trust him even when we cannot see the full picture. Faith is not built in the comfortable places, it is built in the wilderness. One of the most difficult aspects of isolation is that its purpose is often hidden from us in the moment. When we are in the midst of it, we may not understand why we are going through it or what God is doing. It can feel as though we have been forgotten, as though God is silent. But just because God is silent does not mean he is absent. In fact, it is in these times of seeming silence that God is working behind the scenes. He is orchestrating things that you cannot see. He is preparing you for a future that you cannot yet imagine. Just as a potter shapes clay on a wheel, God is shaping you in the hidden places. You may not understand it now, but trust that God has a purpose in your isolation. In Isaiah 49:2, the prophet writes, "He made my mouth like a sharpened sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver." There is a season of hiding, a season of isolation, where God is sharpening and polishing you, preparing you for the moment when he will release you into your purpose. But until then, you are hidden in his quiver, being prepared for the right moment. Do not despise the hidden seasons, for it is in those seasons that God does his most profound work. He is not withholding from you. He is preparing you for something greater than you can comprehend. One of the most crucial lessons that God teaches us in isolation is how to trust his timing. In a world where we are constantly bombarded by the demand for speed and efficiency, we tend to expect everything to happen immediately: success, breakthrough, fulfillment of dreams. But God operates on his own timetable, and it often doesn't match ours. The process of waiting is one of the most challenging tests of faith, but it is also one of the most valuable. Consider Abraham, the father of faith. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. But that promise didn't come to pass immediately. Abraham waited 25 years for the birth of his promised son, Isaac. In that waiting, Abraham experienced moments of doubt, fear, and even impatience. He tried to take matters into his own hands with Hagar, which led to complications. But despite the waiting, God remained faithful to his word. In the end, Abraham's trust in God was vindicated, and the promise was fulfilled at the perfect time. The season of isolation often comes with waiting for God's promises, waiting for clarity, waiting for the next step. It is in this place of waiting that we learn one of the greatest lessons of faith: God's timing is perfect. We may feel ready to step into our purpose, but God knows the perfect moment for our release. In isolation, he prepares us not only for the destination, but for the journey itself. Waiting teaches us patience, perseverance, and trust. It reminds us that we are not in control, God is. It humbles us and brings us to a place of surrender. And it is in that place of surrender that we experience the fullness of God's grace. When we stop striving and start trusting, we position ourselves to receive the blessings that God has for us. Isolation is not only a time of preparation and strengthening, it is also a time where God bursts new vision in us. When we are surrounded by the busyness of life, it is easy to become distracted by the demands of others, the expectations of society, and the noise of our own thoughts. But in isolation, God quiets the external voices so that we can focus on His voice. It is in this quiet place that God often reveals new dreams, new visions, and new purposes for our lives. Let us look at the story of John the Baptist. John was a man who spent much of his life in isolation in the wilderness. The Bible tells us that John was a voice crying out in the wilderness, calling people to repentance and preparing the way for the Messiah. John's isolation was not accidental, it was purposeful. It was in the wilderness that God gave John a unique vision for his life, a vision that was distinct from anyone else's. John's message was radical, and his lifestyle was different, but it was exactly what God needed him to be to fulfill his purpose. In the same way, God often brings us into isolation to birth new vision within us. He separates us from the familiar so that we can see beyond the ordinary. In isolation, we are no longer influenced by the expectations of others, and we can hear God's voice more clearly. He begins to reveal His heart for us, His plans for us, and the unique calling He has placed on our lives. Isolation becomes the place where vision is clarified, refined, and solidified. Some of the greatest visionaries in history received their most profound revelations in moments of solitude. Consider the Apostle John, who, while exiled on the island of Patmos, received the revelation that would become the book of Revelation. Alone on a barren island, far from the bustling world, John received visions of the future, of the end times, and of the return of Christ. His isolation was not a punishment, it was a divine setup for him to receive a vision that would change the course of history. God often uses isolation to pull us away from the distractions of life so that we can see things from His perspective. Isolation is the canvas upon which God paints new dreams and visions. If you are in a season of isolation right now, don't resist it. Instead, ask God to show you the vision He has for your life. Let Him birth something new in you that will shape your future. In addition to being a place of preparation, revelation, and vision, isolation is also a place of transformation. It is a place where the old self must die so that the new self can emerge. This process is often painful, but it is necessary for us to become who God has called us to be. One of the most powerful examples of this transformation is found in the story of Jacob. Jacob was a man known for his deceitful ways. He deceived his brother Esau, stole his birthright, and tricked his father Isaac. But there came a moment in Jacob's life where he could no longer run from his past. In Genesis 32, we find Jacob alone, isolated, on the night before he was to meet his brother Esau. Fearful and uncertain of what the future held, Jacob found himself wrestling with God throughout the night. This wrestling was not just physical, it was symbolic of the inner struggle that Jacob had been facing his entire life. It was in that moment of isolation, alone in the darkness, that Jacob's old self had to die. The man who had spent his life manipulating situations and deceiving others was transformed. As dawn broke, Jacob was no longer the man he once was. God gave him a new name, Israel, and with that name came a new identity, a new purpose, and a new destiny. Jacob's isolation was not a punishment, it was a place of profound transformation where God stripped away his old identity and gave him a new one. In much the same way, God uses isolation in our lives to bring about the death of our old self. He uses isolation to strip away the things that are not of Him, the pride, the fear, the self-reliance, and the insecurities. It is in isolation that God breaks down the false identities we have built for ourselves and replaces them with His truth. It is in isolation that we die to our own plans, our own desires, and our own ambitions, and we surrender fully to God's will for our lives. This process of transformation is not easy. It can be painful to let go of the things we have held on to for so long. But just as a seed must die before it can bring forth new life, so must we die to our old selves before we can step into the fullness of what God has for us. Isolation is the furnace where God refines us, burns away the impurities, and molds us into the image of His Son. Another aspect of isolation that is important to understand is that sometimes God separates us for a season so that He can elevate us later. Divine separation is a theme we see throughout Scripture, and it often precedes as a time of great promotion or blessing. Take, for example, the story of Joseph. Joseph was separated from his family, betrayed by his brothers, and sold into slavery. For years, Joseph experienced isolation in a foreign land, far from the home and family he knew. He was falsely accused, thrown into prison, and left to wonder if he had been forgotten. But during this time of separation, God was working behind the scenes. He was preparing Joseph for a position of great authority. Joseph's isolation was not a punishment. It was a divine separation that was necessary for his elevation. When the time was right, God brought Joseph out of the prison and placed him in the palace. Joseph became second in command in all of Egypt, and it was through him that God saved the nation from famine. Joseph's time of isolation was the crucible that prepared him for the weight of leadership. There are times in our lives when God separates us from people, situations, or environments because He is preparing us for something greater. This separation may feel painful at the time, and we may not understand why it is happening. But we must trust that God knows what He is doing. Divine separation is always for our protection and preparation. Sometimes the people or environments we are attached to are not conducive to the growth that God wants to bring about in our lives. God sees what we cannot see, and He knows what we do not know. He may separate you from certain relationships because those relationships are hindering your progress. He may isolate you from certain situations because those situations are not aligned with His purpose for your life. Divine separation is not rejection, it is God's way of positioning you for elevation. If you find yourself in a season of isolation where it feels like God is pulling you away from the people or things you once held dear, don't resist it. Embrace it. God is preparing you for something greater. He is positioning you for promotion. He is creating space for new opportunities, new relationships, and new blessings to come into your life. One of the most beautiful aspects of isolation is that it often becomes a place of deep intimacy with God. When we are stripped of the distractions and noise of the world, we are able to draw closer to God in ways that we may not have experienced before. Isolation creates the perfect environment for deep communion with the Father. In Psalm 46:10, we are reminded, be still and know that I am God. It is in the stillness, in the quiet moments of isolation, that we come to know God more intimately. We hear His voice more clearly, we feel His presence more tangibly, and we experience His love more deeply. Throughout the Bible, we see that some of the most profound encounters with God happen in moments of isolation. Moses encountered God in the burning bush while he was alone in the wilderness. Elijah heard the still small voice of God while he was alone on Mount Horeb. Jesus often withdrew to solitary places to pray and spend time with His Father. Paul received deep revelations while he was isolated in the Arabian desert. Isolation is where God draws us closer to himself. It is where he invites us to enter into a deeper relationship with him, to know him not just as our creator, but as our father, our friend, and our shepherd. In the quiet place, we come to understand his heart more fully. We experience his grace, his mercy, and his love in new ways. Isolation becomes a place of refuge, a place of renewal, and a place of deep spiritual growth. If you are in a season of isolation, I encourage you to see it as an invitation from God, an invitation to draw near to him, to seek his face, and to know him more intimately. Do not despise the quiet moments, for it is in the quiet that God often does his most profound work in our hearts. Isolation often feels like a place of weakness. You may feel drained, exhausted, or empty, but God uses these moments to renew your strength in ways that only he can. In isolation, we learn to rely on God as our sole source of strength, and this is a vital part of spiritual growth. It is easy to depend on our own resources when things are going well, but when we are stripped of everything else, we are left with the only source that truly matters, God himself. In Isaiah 40:31, we are given a powerful promise, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This scripture beautifully captures the essence of what God does in seasons of waiting and isolation. He doesn't leave us to languish in our weakness. Instead, he renews our strength. This renewal often comes in unexpected ways. Isolation forces us to slow down, and in that stillness, God teaches us that true strength comes from resting in him. We learn that we don't have to strive in our own effort or struggle to maintain control. In isolation, God teaches us that his grace is sufficient and his power is made perfect in our weakness, 2 Corinthians 12:9. Consider the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. After a great victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah found himself in a place of deep despair. He fled into the wilderness, isolated and exhausted, feeling as though he could no longer go on. But in that place of isolation, God met him. God provided food and rest for Elijah and then renewed his strength. He wasn't finished with Elijah yet. There was more work for him to do. But Elijah needed that time of isolation to be replenished physically, emotionally, and spiritually before he could continue in his calling. God does the same for us in our seasons of isolation. He allows us to come to the end of ourselves so that we can experience the fullness of his strength. He reminds us that we are not meant to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, but instead to lean on him. Isolation becomes a place where our strength is renewed, not through our own efforts, but through God's sustaining power. Another profound purpose that God accomplishes in isolation is the deepening of our faith. Faith is not simply believing in God when things are going well. It is trusting him when all evidence suggests otherwise. Isolation often feels like a wilderness of barren, desolate place where it seems like nothing is happening. But it is in these wilderness seasons that faith is truly tested and strengthened. Throughout Scripture, we see examples of God leading his people into the wilderness, a place of isolation, to test and strengthen their faith. The Israelites, after being delivered from Egypt, spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness before entering the promised land. During that time, they were tested in many ways. God provided for their needs manna from heaven, water from a rock, but he also allowed them to experience times of difficulty to see whether they would trust him. In Deuteronomy 8:2-3, Moses explains the purpose of their wilderness experience. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. The wilderness was a place of isolation, but it was also a place where the Israelites learned to depend on God for their daily provision. Their faith was deepened as they experienced God's faithfulness in new ways. In the same way, God uses seasons of isolation in our lives to deepen our faith. He strips away the things we have relied on so that we can learn to rely on him completely. Faith is not just about seeing the promise, it's about trusting God in the process. In isolation, we may not see the full picture, but God is teaching us to walk by faith, not by sight, 2 Corinthians 5:7. He is calling us to trust him even when we can't see the outcome, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. This kind of faith is precious to God because it reflects a deep trust in his character and his promises. When you are in a season of isolation and it feels like God is silent or distant, remember that he is still at work. He is using this time to strengthen your faith, to teach you to trust him in new ways, and to refine your character. Isolation is not the absence of God's presence. It is often the place where we encounter him most deeply. Isolation and the expansion of capacity. Another important aspect of isolation is that it is a time when God expands our capacity. God never wastes a season, and he often uses isolation to enlarge our ability to handle greater responsibility, greater influence, and greater blessing in the future. This expansion of capacity happens in the hidden, quiet moments where God stretches us beyond what we thought we could handle, preparing us for the next level of our calling. In the Bible, we see this principle at work in the life of David. Before David became king, he spent years in isolation tending sheep in the fields. During this time, David learned how to protect the flock from lions and bears, a skill that would later help him defeat Goliath. God was expanding David's capacity in the hidden places, teaching him how to be a shepherd, how to lead, and how to fight battles in private long before he fought them in public. David's time in isolation wasn't wasted. It was essential preparation for his future role as king. God used the isolation to stretch him, to grow him, and to expand his capacity to handle the weight of leadership. When the time came for David to step into his destiny, he was ready because he had been faithful in the hidden seasons. In the same way, God uses isolation to expand our capacity. He may be preparing you for a future that requires more strength, more wisdom, or more endurance than you currently have. In isolation, God is stretching you, growing you, and expanding your capacity to handle the blessings and responsibilities that are coming. It may feel uncomfortable at times, but trust that God is increasing your ability to carry what he has planned for you. If you are in a season where it feels like you are being stretched beyond your limits, take heart. God is preparing you for something greater. He is expanding your capacity so that you will be able to carry the full weight of the calling he has placed on your life. Don't despise the stretching. It is part of the process of preparation, isolation, and character development. Isolation is often the furnace in which character is forged. While we may be focused on the external result, success, recognition, achievement, God is far more concerned with what is happening internally. In seasons of isolation, God works on our character, refining us, shaping us, and molding us into the image of Christ. One of the clearest examples of this process is found in the life of Joseph. As we mentioned earlier, Joseph spent years in isolation, first as a slave in Egypt and later as a prisoner. During these years, Joseph's character was being refined. He learned humility, patience, and integrity in ways that would prepare him to handle the power and influence he would later have as second in command of Egypt. In the same way, God uses isolation to shape our character. He uses the hidden seasons to work on the areas of our lives that need refining: our pride, our impatience, our selfishness, our fear. It is in isolation that God deals with the issues of the heart, the things that no one else sees but are crucial to our spiritual growth. Character is built in the hidden places. It is easy to maintain a facade of integrity when we are in the public eye, but true character is revealed in the private moments when no one else is watching. God often isolates us to test and refine our character because he knows that our integrity is more important than our talent, our gifting, or our success. Consider the life of Moses. Before Moses could lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he spent 40 years in isolation in the desert. During that time, God was working on his character, preparing him to be the leader that the Israelites needed. The desert was not a waste of time. It was a time of preparation, a time where Moses' character was being shaped. In isolation, God may be refining your character for a future assignment. He may be working on your patience, teaching you how to trust him in difficult circumstances. He may be working on your humility, reminding you that it is not by your strength, but by his that you will succeed. He may be working on your integrity, preparing you to handle greater responsibility with honor and righteousness. Whatever the specific lesson, know that God is working on your character in isolation because he wants you to be able to sustain the blessings and responsibilities that are coming. He doesn't just want you to succeed externally. He wants you to have the internal strength and integrity to carry what he has called you to do.